You're tuned in to Reimagine 2021, version 11, the #1 virtual crypto and blockchain conference. Our experts ponder the question of what DAOs mean for government structure in this next segment of Reimagine version 11.
In the future, do you ever see governments or countries utilizing this structure similar to a DAO?
I think that's a tough question to answer. I think I don't personally really see it just yet, just in terms of how behind people are already on any crypto-related regulations. I think DAOs would be something completely different that they just couldn't wrap their heads around and would find that would take a really long time for government officials and governments to, I think, be open to the concept. But I think with Web3, something Web3 has taught me is like never say never, right? People have been doing so many crazy things, and there's so many things that are being done right now that I would have not thought possible a year ago. So I want to say my answer to that is maybe, but my personal view was probably more leaning towards no.
But what are some competitive advantages to setting it up a structure with a DAO as opposed to traditional centralized structure?
I mean, I'm not like an expert on this kind of stuff, but I'm pretty sure with like a centralized kind of entity, you have to assign like board members and people. There's like people in control, and then there's other people beneath it. I think DAOs function similar to like public companies, where you have like the board and the core members, and then you have like the majority shareholders, and then you have like the rest of the community who might have like smaller ownership or like less amount of tokens, NFTs, et cetera, whatever the membership is. So I think that those two are comparable, whereas like an LLC or like a sole proprietorship or like S Corp, C Corp, those kind of things, I don't know if there's like, if a DAO represents like the best substitution for those kinds of things, because a lot of those like maybe aren't shared ownership. But if you're trying to do something that's like collective, community-based, like a shared ownership project, almost like a cooperative, it's like an internet cooperative, I think then a DAO presents a great opportunity and like vehicle for that. But otherwise you might want to go with like a regular entity.
Definitely. So it might not be for everything. And one important aspect of DAOs is, of course, governance. So what effect does distributed governance have on free markets?
That's a good question. So basically, there's two kind of routes. There's like the DAO idealist route, I think, where there's perfect shared ownership. Everyone kind of has like equal shares, like voting is like evenly distributed. It's perfect. The community also is like invited in, and maybe like founders or like core contributors maybe don't have like that much of a leg up in like voting and governance rights than like community members who are able to like buy in from the market and contribute and vote. Oftentimes that's not the case. It's really difficult to get to that unless you have like a very clear like tokenomics from the start that sets it up for that. But even then, it's difficult to maintain that framework. And in a lot of cases, I think the fear and like what a lot of people have seen is when it's too community owned, things might not get properly done. Or maybe the community votes to throw a party and at NFT NYC and wants to drain like 250K from like the treasury in order to throw this party. Like maybe the core founders are like, no, this is like an awful idea, instead of like using that money for development. But maybe the community is like, no, this is an excellent idea. We have no idea anything about building companies or structures or whatever, like developing like the platform. We just want to throw a party. So I think there's like pros and cons to both. I think like the ideal setup, and I think a lot of people will agree on this, at least from what we've seen so far, is that there's like the DAO functions similar to a public company where there's the board and the decision makers and like core shareholders, and they kind of make informed decisions on like product, roadmap, like executing on things. And those are also subject to the community vote as well, but might not have as strong of a weighting. And then the other option, I guess, would be to like be fully decentralized, but there's like a high risk of like a lot of people don't vote or like participate in governance. And so if you have like a fully distributed thing, you might end up having like unequal weighting in like a fully decentralized kind of route, or maybe like people don't know what is actually best for it or can make informed decisions from like a professional and experience-based standpoint, and are just kind of like, you know, if I'm a doctor and you're like an artist in a scenario, and I'm trying to prescribe a medical diagnosis, like, does it matter what you think I should be prescribed, like diagnosing like my patient? Probably not, because you probably don't know anything about like all these complex different illnesses and what could be possibly going wrong with them. And I think the same thing is kind of true for like DAOs as well. Like some people might not have any idea what's up, but might just be voting because they're like, yeah, this is cool. And they have the right to do that. But it's good to like have a group of people that can make proper decisions and that are maybe voted in by the community to make those decisions, to kind of like handle a lot of that governing. And that's kind of like how our democracy functions too.
What effect will distributing governance to communities, what effect will that have on the markets?
You know, the positive view is its true democratization, right? The owners of the entity have a say in how it's run. So instead of the nameless, faceless corporation and the senior executives taking all the wealth and having the greatest wealth and income inequality in the history of mankind today, maybe that trend goes the other way and we start to push value down, because I would think the community would vote to enhance the community's ownership stake than rather siphon it up to the CEO, probably, or the crony boards. Now, some would say, but maybe those participants aren't qualified to make those decisions. There's actually some truth in some of that. I mean, not everybody has the same level of education or knowledge or understanding of the technology and the structure. But at the end of the day, I think a broader distributed ownership is more likely to make good decisions for the benefit of that community than people at the top of the corporation. You know, history tells us that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that distributed power liberates. So I think there's so many examples where that power has siphoned up to the top of traditional organizations, and it's been bad. And I think the idea that maybe there will be some examples that don't work out in a DAO first world, which I guess Tyler Ward coined that term, so I have to give him credit. But in a DAO first world, maybe there'll be some examples where it doesn't work out. Fine. I can point to plenty of corporations where it hasn't worked out very well.
I think the more it's distributed, the more democratized the whole system gets. Now, maybe another thing is, so we're not having just a conversation of being super bullish on this stuff. Another side to it, I think, is voter turnout in elections, which I think is the most important thing for a lot of people, is still really, really poor for a variety of different reasons. Same thing with equity shareholder votes. The turnout there is also not that important. And if you think about it, you go, well, how come it's not important when it's your money or your future or your leader who's going to decide your future, right? Well, there's so many different, probably small reasons that lead up to the one reason or another as to why someone doesn't go up to the voting polls and vote. So that's where with DAOs, I think it's the same tension exists. Just because you have this new streamlined voting structure doesn't mean that the voter turnout's going to be really strong. So I think that's up to the community and the projects that are developing these things to make sure that this voting structure continues to be more streamlined. So perhaps from an infrastructure layer, creating better tooling, perhaps if it's something as accessible as something like an application on your mobile device, that might create better turnout. Another side of the spectrum with community, maybe it's like if you vote 3 times in a row, 4 times in a row, you unlock another tier where you're upgraded in that community and you have a new accolade or maybe a new NFT that has value or something like that, where you're seeing kind of where I'm getting at. It's like, how do you build more resilience to this DAO structure with like kind of tacking things on a little bit?
And kind of looking for, so what do you think are other metrics do you think need to move for DAOs to really go mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just growth as a whole of the ecosystem. The bigger this ecosystem gets, not just with NFTs, but just any on-chain asset class, the better. It kind of is like rising tides lift all boats type narrative. So I think that's always something that most people in the industry, especially those that have been in it for a while, really care about. It's like, we're all part of different projects at this point, but when Bitcoin does really well, all of a sudden it brings everybody together and it's kumbaya again, it seems. Same thing with DAOs. I think that's what you need first and foremost. I think the second part is really smart and talented groups of people to come together and figure out how can we stretch this farther? How can we make sure that the distribution of tokens is as egalitarian as possible and democratized, making sure that there's not concentrations of wealth. There's plenty of mistakes that have been made, plenty of also correct decisions that have been made. That's like one potential example. Another side is, well, once it gets to a point where let's pick the example of DAOs where it's a kind of like a membership token. Let's say you have a membership and it's first virtual and you have a Discord and you have all access to this community and network. Well, great, but now what? What's next? So how do you transition that and grow it further? And how do you properly communicate that to the community members? So it's basically like, long and short of it is, how can you have a strategy pre-launch and then making sure that you can have something that sustains decades, if not centuries, hopefully. And that's, I think, the way people should be thinking about this type of technology.
Yeah, so distributed markets and decentralized networks, I think, are going to change the way that we think about interacting with each other online from a market perspective. So, centralized markets originally, they were the ones that are in control of people's ability to transact. They create trust between two individuals or two organizations. They take a large fee for doing that. And no one else is incentivized or incentivized to be the one to help them be able to make those transactions. And so with a decentralized market and decentralized governance of that market, what I think you're doing is you're able to allow people who are participating in the market to also be beneficiaries of that same market. So by running or by participating in like a liquidity pool, for example, you're able to create liquidity for other people to use for lending. And all of a sudden now the person who is providing that liquidity is actually incentivized to do so in a very more maybe democratic way or fair way. Whereas before, I'd say, the centralized authority would be the one that ends up being the biggest beneficiary of providing that liquidity to the rest of the users within that same network. And so it's dissolving this intermediary and allowing participants to actually be the beneficiaries. And I think that's sort of the biggest shift that I'm starting to see.
Can you kind of break down, just for everyday people, why should they care about governance and how could it benefit them in the future?
Yeah, I think governance is really important, and specifically the decentralization of governance is important because it allows for fair decisions to be made. Having decentralized governance means that no individual entity has more control over another, and decisions have to be made together. So, there's various versions of governance that you can have. One where you've got, a dictator, for example, that's making all of the decisions, which is one end of the extreme, all the way through to the other end of the extreme, which is completely decentralized governance, where they're decentralized across time and geographies, jurisdictions, their special interests. And I think the closer that we can get to full decentralization of governance, the better off we are in terms of creating a fair place for people to be able to interact and engage.
We're used to, at the moment, governing blockchains, nodes, validators. Do you think we can govern ourselves in these DAOs?
So I have this saying, right? It's easier to move bits than it is to move atoms.
Yeah.
So it's way more easy to write code and ship code than it is to convince human beings what to do, right? I have this saying, you know, that it's always easier to move bits than it is to move atoms. Where, you know, bits, it's much easier to write code and ship code than it is to convince human beings kind of what to do, right? Or coordinate human beings. And DAO is a perfect example of that, right? Where you kind of a collision of, you know, actually code meeting like people that are, you know, making decisions based on, you know, on behalf of the DAO. So it's almost like a digital kind of cryptographically enforced version of like activist shareholders, right? So Carl Icahn being the most infamous example of that. Now everyone can become a Carl Icahn, right? If you have a participating vote as a governance token holder in a DAO, you can now, if you disagree with what's going on with the DAO, you can vote, right? And you can convince people in a digital online community to vote with you, or, you know, and there's a lot of things that can happen there. So I think it's really, really interesting. And but like you said, like coordinating the people, that's still a problem. And DAOs don't necessarily solve that. They might actually make it more complicated in some ways, but at least it gives, you know, people a voice, you know, to be able to kind of give an example of like what they actually want.
And kind of relating to startups, like, well, first of all, do you think these are going to be the new legal structures, you know, organizational structures moving forward, these entities, as opposed to like an LLC? It's not going to be one or the other, but you know what I mean? Is this going to be another option, alternative to just form a DAO rather than, you know, go this traditional route?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, you know, I think some of the community, even like in Fedora has been discussing, you know, we recently announced a $100 million ecosystem fund. And, you know, I think the community definitely wants to form that as a DAO. You know, the steps to create a DAO are actually quite complicated, especially when you're looking at that much money, right? You know, and the structure and how it's formed, the actual security of the DAO contract itself. There's a lot of moving parts there. So we're kind of sifting through and trying to figure out how to do that. Now, will it replace the legal system? I don't think so. I think the legal system will continue to operate, and there'll be LLCs and there'll be corporations. But where I think DAOs can come in as, you know, actually kind of as a supplement to the legal system, where you can have these cryptographically enforced contracts that can actually help execute some of the legal side. So, you know, will it be completely, you know, DAOs maybe in 1,000 years or you know, something in the future? But I don't think anything like in the near future. But I think they will complement each other, especially when it doesn't make sense to form, for instance, like international organizations, right? A lot of blockchain developers and crypto community is global by default. Yeah. Forming a company that crosses borders in lots of different countries is incredibly complex. And it's actually a big problem.
Just on the H1, like some of these visas, right, to hire people, even that process is costly, and you can't really attract talent, you know, quite the distance as much as you would like. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a great example. You know, when the policy for hiring, you know, international people has a lot of friction, the market will find a solution. Yeah. And maybe the DAO is that solution, right? Where, you know, these DAOs can actually form and fund development and talent across a variety of different skill sets in a much less friction way. Which I think is really cool.
We can govern blockchains through technology. Mm-hmm. Can we govern ourselves, you think, operating a DAO?
Yeah, I think, you know, just to start, the proof of work, I think Bitcoin has done a disservice by claiming that. Because to me, proof of work is basically what a DAO is meant to do, right? Again, you get out what you put in. That's my proof of work. I've, you know, tagged 30 people in this Instagram post. I've written a new code base for this new feature. I've peer reviewed someone else's code base for this new feature. I'm doing work that I need to showcase to everybody, right? There's no black boxes in a DAO. To answer your question about whether we can self-form using DAOs, I think DAOs are an important pillar of that, but from my own experience, putting something into a DAO isn't going to solve the problem. You really need to have people that have respect for each other and also have some type of common denominator across to them, right? And this is why I think DAOs are very bottoms up. They're not top down, right? If I get together 3 or 4 people that happen to be, you know, the foremost experts in the world about a particular topic, then that belongs in a DAO. But everyone that's interested in that topic, then they're spectators to the DAO, right? The DAO in itself has to have, you know, value within it, knowledge within it that needs to be orchestrated better. But absent of that knowledge or that value, the DAO is just a tool, right? DAO is just a set of smart contracts that make sure people play by the rules, right? But without the right people in the DAO or the right devices or, you know, other types of autonomous mechanisms within the DAO, then it kind of falls apart, right? But I think that is a huge call to action for anyone that is very, very passionate about anything, right? If you put 50 super climate-focused people into a DAO that have similar goals and similar ideas, it's a way for them to collaborate, it's a way for them to peer review, and it's a way for them to really ascribe value as far as progressing a common goal, right?
So let's talk about smart contracts, right? Smart contracts are really what enables DAOs to work, right? Blockchains are these ledgers that keep track of these events and ownership and status and you know of where accounts are. Smart contracts actually allow you to add computation to the mix to say, well, we want to change, you know, this thing, and so like let's say there's a vote, and then people literally through the blockchain can vote. And then that vote comes together, and what it ends up being an Oracle input to a smart contract. And was the vote positive? Was it a yes? Did it fail or pass? And it passed. Well, if it passes, then it tells the contract on the other side what to do. Okay? Now, you could have, that's the way it works on chain. And so I think for people, like non-technical people, you could kind of think of it as you know, smart contracts enable you to create decision frameworks that help govern groups of people.
Definitely, and as you summed it up pretty well. And any drawbacks to DAOs? Collusion, you know, technical risks, you know, I guess sticking to the common goal, right? A lot of these people come together for DAOs. But anyways, at a high level, do you see any drawbacks to DAOs?
You know, the interesting thing now, I went to DAOCon in Denver last month. It was really cool. It was just a very small conference of just all the thought leaders in DAOs. And right now there's so much controversy and different opinions on how DAOs should be run and governed. And so one of the potential issues is that whales and large wallets end up just controlling these DAO structures, and they actually become a new form of a middleman. Now, my feeling is that I think you know, then there's things like quadratic voting and other mechanisms that they can try to use to try to like give more of a balanced power to all users.
And I think, sorry for the listeners, like quadratic voting is you kind of have to maybe potentially pay for your extra vote, depending, it's weighted.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's one aspect, but it's weighted, and you know, there's some kind of, I don't know, you really have to double down if you're really going to put your vote down, and it shows like who's actually caring or not, right?
Yeah, and there's other methods too where, along with quadratic voting, to try to balance more voice to money. But my feeling is, I actually think, you know, hey, the people who have money in these systems are the most, you know, have the most skin in the game. And you know, when you compare a decentralized, a DAO with an on-chain voting structure to a centralized business, you're already, you know, light years ahead of where we were before.
DAOs are one of the most interesting and emerging trends in the ecosystem. So DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And it's only a brand new form of human collaboration. I mean, it's not very often that these ideas come around and that they get to be used in the wild. And it's a fascinating example of, you can have people from all over the world who may not know each other in person, may not have anything in common, but they have a shared interest and they have a vote, right? They have sway over how resources get used. And this creates all sorts of fascinating emergent social phenomena, and it's working, I think, far better than anyone could have imagined. It's also begging all sorts of new questions.
One of the questions I have is, why does it require blockchain crypto? How does this technology influence a DAO?
So there's sort of, at least from my perspective, there's two necessary components for a DAO to function in the real world that requires blockchains, right? One is you have financial assets to control, which again, it really helps to have them on chain. And then two, you need some sort of mechanisms for voting for people to express their opinion and view that can't be tampered with because, by the way, there's real value at stake. And so crypto provides both of those capabilities, particularly smart contract platforms. And so it's sort of the minimum set of requirements necessary to provide this new form of coordination and collaboration.
And talking about human coordination and collaboration and social scalability, we're used to governing blockchains, nodes, validators, right? Can we govern ourselves?
It's an open question if we can govern ourselves. If there's this concept in DAOs called Moloch, which is sort of I believe, the demon or god of miscommunication, of inefficiency, right? And the whole idea is to overcome that. And I would certainly say it's pretty fun to be experimenting there and to be working at sort of the bleeding edge of the state of the art in human coordination and collaboration and how disparate communities can come together around a shared interest and actually make positive change, actually do something. And so I am optimistic that we'll be able to write code that helps make the human condition more efficient.
Do you think DAOs are scalable?
Yeah, I mean, like, does democracy scale? I think so. I think it's going to require a different framework, a different skill set for people part of these DAOs. I think we've grown up to sort of think about companies and hierarchies, and we don't really have, a lot of us don't have the skill sets of working in a DAO. But I think there's a lot of people who just jumped in and are starting to work with these DAOs, and they actually pick up, how do I use this to my advantage? How do I leverage the DAO to really like enable myself to do more? And I think it's going to be a skill set. And once that framework has sort of been figured out and that spreads, I think that's when you're going to start seeing the scaling of DAOs. Is not only is the infrastructure and tools there, but also the personal mindset of the people part of it has to also shift. And then you're going to see more scalability.
I think the answer to, is it scalable? Is the DAO model scalable? It doesn't matter, because ultimately it's software and hopefully it's free markets. And when you combine the two, the water will seek its level, as they say in plumbing, I guess, and the markets will figure it out. If it makes more sense to set it up in a 1940s structure of joint stock companies, which is what we call a C Corp in the US, fine, do it that way, right? If it makes more sense to set up a decentralized autonomous organization or create a car that has no owner and drives itself around and is useful to the public all day, and the original owner basically spun it out to become a DAO and made their money and let the car end of life itself, and then at the end of the day drove itself to the ESG compliant recycling place where its parts did whatever they had to do, so be it.
What do you think will, and it depends on the DAO too. There's 4-person DAOs, there's tens and hundreds. I guess it just depends on the community, what the goals are, what the objectives are. And it, just like crypto, this is going to provide another opportunity to establish a different kind of organizational structure for however
the
it applies.
most uncorruptible bank you could create would have no owners, would have no off switch, would be open 24/7, would have no abilities for governments to artificially regulate and give somebody a artificial monopoly, which is what some of these licenses are, right? Which sounds a lot like a DAO, meaning I could deposit crypto, take out a loan against it in dollars, right? So that now I have lending. I could use social scores to create an unsecuritized loan, for example, right? If somehow I could prove my digital ID. I could make bets on stock prices, right? Using a CFD-like model, but all in a way that those overlords couldn't shut off. That is totally possible today. It's complex. Involves a lot of integration into the physical world, because I have to know the price of those shares if I'm making a bet on the stock price, for example. That creates opportunities for regulators, but we'll work that out. It's just software at the end of the day.